and dismissal of them and their importance. So there is this tension, I think, between that historical mistrust and dismissal and this eagerness they have now, this investment in redefining popular television texts and characters as affiliated with their faith. What motivates them? What do they say about their personal or communal investments in redefining these texts and characters in ways that are more aligned with their faith experience? Finally, but not least, Elijah Siegler's paper begins with an inversion of the panel's title, as was noted by Jane. Rather than spiritual but not religious, he titles his paper Religious but Not Spiritual. While some would argue that the spiritual realm encompasses the mundane, pedestrian, vulgar, and violent, Siegler points to the work of writer-producer Tom Fontana as refreshing and intelligent, in that his work is not spiritual in conventional, expected, or overtly moralistic ways. Elijah's paper takes the form of an auteur study, looking at specific texts of writer-producer Tom Fontana, particularly his work on St. Elsewhere, another one of my favorite programs, Homicide, and Oz. There may be some pitfalls in taking kind of an auteurist approach to Siegler's work, and I think if Liz were here, her emphasis on context, industrial and cultural context for these texts, and how they interact with Fontana would be an interesting complement to what you talked about today. I very much enjoyed this paper and its perspective on some of my favorite television fare. What came to mind as I read this paper was how Siegler's expectation of Fontana's work and thematics seemed very similar to those of one of my favorite fiction writers, a Presbyterian minister by the name of Frederick Buechner. I don't know if that registers with anybody. Look him up. It seems in Fontana and Buechner's work that there is this constant concern with how ordinary life, even the vulgar and profane, might be connected to the transcendent or divine. Along these lines, Buechner writes that Christianity is mainly wishful thinking. He says, sometimes wishing is the wings on which truth comes in. Sometimes truth is what sets us wishing for it. In the fictional worlds and works of Fontana and Buechner, I believe that one can see both the vomit, tears, and shit of everyday life, the deep riddles and agonies of human existence, and as one critic put it, a trust in the reality and unexpectedness of grace and possibility. Thank you for your papers.
First, I wanted to talk a little bit about Charles Taylor, because I do think that's a really apt comparison to some of the things that we've been discussing in this panel, and the way in which he argues that religion is not fading away but proliferating and pluralizing. And one of the things that I was interested in with Lost is that I think that the text itself appeals to people who tend to be more comfortable with ambiguity than perhaps people who aren't. In other words, it may be that Lost, to some extent, is not the same audience that Touched by an Angel drew, which is much less about ambiguity than it is about certainty and about reinforcement of certain approaches to the divine. But I think that one of the things that pop culture always does, and probably would be interesting to pair with Charles Taylor's analysis, is that it always has a role in articulating our ideology of the moment. And actually, kind of going back to Karl Mannheim, in some ways popular culture really articulates the tension between ideology and utopia. And I think that, in terms of ideology, I think popular culture is always interesting because in order to be popular, it has to be able to draw together people and create, in a way, an alliance that doesn't exist in our pretty fractured world, and particularly in the United States context. But I think that it's always interesting to look at those very popular forms that seem to be able to speak across ideological perspectives and that demonstrate that not only is religion not fading away, but that there are very different ways in which we can read the same kinds of traditions or non-traditions or anti-tradition. I think about probably the best example of that is Forrest Gump, which conservatives loved for certain reasons, because they saw it as pro-patriotic, pro-US, and then liberals loved because it was about, or some liberals did, because it was, you know, recognizing anti-Vietnam and kind of telling the importance of the 60s in a fairy tale kind of way. So I think there are ways in which popular culture does that kind of thing. It's able to speak to both. But I do think that one of the roles that we then play as analysts is to try to kind of pull that apart and try to see what does that mean for us as things are changing and as a certain percentage of people are very fearful of those changes. How are texts speaking to those ongoing anxieties that we have?
Yeah, let me just respond really briefly to Steve's comment about the auteur theory. I'll leave the secularization thesis for a later time, or never. Not that I've thought about it. Yeah, I mean, definitely there's, I mean, I'm not maintaining that. I mean, I guess part of my reason for writing this paper in the way I did was to say, not to say the auteur theory is great, but to say if you can use the auteur theory, especially in terms of religious artists, like in film, like Ingmar Bergman, you know, or Scorsese as religious artists, isn't it time that we start to use that theory in TV as well? And it's more difficult, I think, because TV isn't seen as having a clear author. But film wasn't either until Bazin came along and said, hey, the director is really the auteur, it's his vision that you need, which has its own problems. But I think with, you know, Fontana, some other people, you know, Milch, David Kelly, maybe you can argue that these are auteurs, and so you can analyze TV. The unit of analysis isn't necessarily an episode or a series, but it's an individual, which certainly has all the same pitfalls that auteur theory does in film studies, but it also has some of the potential benefits. So it's at least worth trying, I think.
We have a few minutes. Maybe we can go just a few minutes after 2:45 for questions. Come on. We'll sweep along. So go ahead there and then we'll go to Vincent.
Okay. To respond to the premise that House is unattractive, say the obvious that he's really hot. But I'm not saying that in just a flippant way. I mean, the problem with this character is that he's so appealing. And in seasons 1 and 2, you know, he's so miserable, he's so mean, but he's really attractive. He's this classic kind of Mr. Rochester character who's never going to be redeemed. You know, he's not going to meet the right woman, he's going to finally break through on the inside. And I think that the reason that seasons 3 and 4 sort of spiral down and become less compelling for me is because the show is trying to deal with that. How are we going to deal with this character who can never redeem? And they make all the characters around him try to, you know, get on board with the talking group. Just talk about your feelings and be fine, and won't, you know, play the game. So the show, it has to stay open. It can't resolve itself. So it's just kind of chasing its own tail at this point because it can't deal with the
Does the atheism that he expresses, how does that play into, though, this kind of perceived unattractiveness that Liz is? Do you have any?
Well, I mean, that's part of what would make him unattractive to a general broad audience of Americans who expect everyone to at least be spiritual, if not religious. Right. You have to believe in something. And in a way, the characters around him keep telling him that over and over again, are voicing that wider, you know, way that we understand TV in general. Everyone believes in something. Everyone has a special Christmas issue, special in every show. We've been with Christmas here. Underneath it all, they believe in something. And he just refuses to play that game.
If I could address that just from Liz's, because I've heard Liz speak on this actually, and I've heard her address that issue, and she's talked about how the atheism is sort of the space that enables you to, you know, it's what makes him attractive and broken, and, you know, sort of, it makes you as an audience desire that he would be fixed. It sort of is part of that driving, you know, narrative of House.
I don't desire him to be fixed.
Yeah.
Suits and Fox desire him to be fixed. They keep giving the writers plots to try to fix him. You know, and he's just, no, I want to be broken.
Yes, that follows up on this? Or? Okay. Why don't we go to...
I had a question for Lynn, actually. I appreciated this